On August 19, 2011, three men walked out of a courthouse in Jonesboro, Arkansas, and into the late summer heat. They had been inside for 18 years, inside various institutions, inside cells, inside a legal system that had decided they were guilty in 1994, and had spent the following 18 years finding ways to defend that decision. Damien Echols had spent those years on death row. He had entered prison at 18 and was leaving at 36. Jason Baldwin had entered at 16. Jesse Miskelly at 17. They were free, but not in the way that the word usually means. What they had signed to secure their release was an Alford plea, a legal instrument that allowed them to maintain their innocence publicly, while simultaneously acknowledging that the prosecution had sufficient evidence to convict them. The state of Arkansas agreed to release them for time served. In exchange, the state did not have to say it was wrong. No investigator was disciplined. No prosecutor was censured. No official of any kind was asked to account for 18 years of three men's lives. The legal record in Arkansas still shows, as of today, 3 convictions for the murders of 3 8-year-old boys. The men who were convicted maintain they did not commit the murders. The DNA found at the crime scene does not match them. The confession that was the primary evidence against them was given by a 17-year-old with an IQ of 72 after 12 hours of interrogation without an attorney and was recanted almost immediately. But Arkansas did not exonerate them. Arkansas released them. There is a difference, and the difference matters, and Arkansas understood the difference perfectly when it chose the Alford plea over a new trial. This is not a story about whether Damien Echols is innocent. Most of the people who have examined this case carefully have concluded that he is, and the evidence supports that conclusion. This is a story about a small town in Arkansas that needed something in the spring of 1993, needed it badly quickly, with the particular urgency of a community that has had something terrible happen inside it and cannot sit with uncertainty. About what that town found and what it cost, and about what it still has not been willing to say. West Memphis, Arkansas is not Memphis, Tennessee. They share a name and a river. The Mississippi runs between them wide and brown and unhurried, but they are different places in ways that go deeper than geography. Memphis is a city. West Memphis is a town of about 25,000 people in Crittenden County on the Arkansas side of the river in the flat lowland country where the delta begins. It is a working-class town historically dependent on trucking and agriculture and the industries that cluster around interstate highways. In 1993, by any measure of economic well-being, it was a town under pressure. Poverty rates above the state average schools underfunded the particular strain that settles on communities that have been left behind by the larger economy. It was also, in the way of many small towns in that part of the South, a deeply religious community. Not in the sense of formal observance, only though the churches were central and well attended, but in the sense of a shared moral vocabulary. A shared understanding of what was right and what was wrong, and what the world looked like when those categories were violated. The evangelical Christianity of West Memphis in 1993 was not a peripheral feature of the town's life. It was the structure through which the town understood itself. Into this community in the early 1990s came the tail end of the Satanic Panic. The national wave of fear about organized satanic abuse that had begun in the mid-1980s and had worked its way through the country's preschools and daycare centers, and eventually into its high schools and its small towns. By 1993, the panic was past its peak in most places. In West Memphis, it arrived on schedule. Damien Eccles was 18 years old in the spring of 1993. He wore black clothing. He listened to heavy metal music. He had checked books about Wicca out of the public library. He had told a therapist at some point in his troubled adolescence that he was interested in the occult. He had been in trouble before minor incidents, shoplifting, the kinds of infractions that accumulate around teenagers who are struggling and who do not fit the shape their community expects of them. In a different town at a different time, Damien Eccles might have been nothing more than a difficult teenager on his way to becoming eventually a complicated adult. In West Memphis, Arkansas in 1993, he was the kind of person a frightened community looks at and thinks they're. On the evening of May 5, 1993, three 8-year-old boys rode their bicycles away from their homes in West Memphis and did not come back. Steve Branch, Michael Moore, Christopher Byers, second graders, all of them friends the way 8-year-old boys are friends, bound by proximity and age and the specific freedom of a weekday evening in a neighborhood where children were still allowed to move through the streets without adult supervision. They had gone off together after school. By dinner time, they had not returned. Their parents called each other. Then they called the police. The search that night found nothing. The following morning, May 6th, a detective noticed a shoe floating in a drainage ditch in a forested area called Robin Hood Hills. The bodies of all three boys were found in the ditch naked, hog-tied with their own shoelaces, bearing injuries consistent with severe beating. Christopher Byers had additional injuries that would later be disputed at length. Whether they were made before or after death by a human hand or by an animal became one of the central contested questions of the investigation and the trials. West Memphis went into a state of shock that is recognizable across communities and across decades, the specific shock of the violent death of children, which carries a quality of horror unlike almost any other crime. Because children's deaths violate the most fundamental assumption that communities make about themselves, that the small and vulnerable will be protected. The police were under immediate and intense pressure to find whoever had done this. The community needed them to find it quickly. Uncertainty in a moment like this is its own kind of unbearable. The police had a theory before they had evidence. They had been thinking about Damien Eccles before the bodies were even found. He was known to them, known to the schools, known to the community as someone who did not fit, who made people uncomfortable, whose interests and appearance and manner suggested to the people looking at him something wrong. After the murders, a woman named Vicki Hutchison told police that she had information connecting Eccles and his friends to the crime. She would later testify at trial. She would later recant, saying that the police had told her what to say. On June 3, 1993, police brought in Jesse Miskelly. Jesse Miskelly Jr. was 17 years old. He had grown up in West Memphis and knew Damien Eccles and Jason Baldwin not closely, not as a core member of their social group, but in the way that teenagers in a small town know each other. He had his own struggles. He had dropped out of school. He was working odd jobs. He was not by any account someone who navigated the world easily. Psychologists who later evaluated him placed his IQ at approximately 72, a number that corresponds in terms of functional ability to roughly a fourth-grade level of academic comprehension. Think about what it means to sit in a police interrogation room for 12 hours when you are 17 years old. When your ability to understand complex language and abstract consequence is limited. When the people across the table from you are adults with authority and with a specific outcome they need you to produce. Think about the hours of questions. The same questions framed different ways pressing toward the same answer. The promises and the suggestions and the implicit and explicit messages about what cooperation might mean and what resistance might cost. Jesse Miskelly sat in that room from early morning until late in the evening. His father was in the building. He was not allowed in the room. No attorney was present for any of the interrogation. Of the more than 12 hours that Miskelly spent being questioned, 46 minutes were recorded. The rest, the hours before the recorder was turned. On the hours during which the shape of the confession was formed exist only in the memories of the people who were there. The recorded confession that emerged contains errors. Miskelly described the time of the attack as morning. The boys had disappeared in the evening. He described the boys as tied with rope. They had been tied with their own shoelaces. He placed himself at the scene in ways that did not match the physical evidence. He described details of the crime that were factually wrong in ways that should have given investigators pause, should have prompted the question of whether the person describing the crime had actually been there. The investigators did not pause. They had their confession. Miskelly recanted within days. He said he had told them what they wanted to hear because he wanted to go home. His attorney instructed him to say nothing further. The confession given under conditions that would later be extensively challenged, containing errors that should have undermined its reliability, recanted almost immediately, became the foundational piece of evidence in trials that would send 3 teenagers to prison for a combined total of 54 years, plus a death sentence. The trials were held in 1994. 2 separate proceedings. Miskelly was tried first, then Eccles and Baldwin together. The prosecution presented what it called evidence of satanic involvement. An expert in occult practices was called to testify. The expert examined photographs of the crime scene and described for the jury the ways in which the wounds and the positioning of the bodies were consistent with satanic ritual murder. The expert's credentials were later questioned. His methodology looking at crime scene photographs and identifying satanic significance in them was later questioned by forensic professionals across the country. At the time, he testified in a courtroom in West Memphis, Arkansas, and the jury listened. The prosecution also presented physical evidence of the defendant's involvement in Satanism. Jason Baldwin's Metallica T-shirts, books that Damien Eccles had checked out from the public library, a journal in which Eccles had written about his interests and his interior life in the way that teenagers write in journals with intensity and darkness, and the specific adolescent drama of someone who is trying to understand what kind of person he is. These items, T-shirts, library books, a private journal, were presented to a jury as evidence of a capacity for ritualistic murder. They were admitted. They were treated as meaningful. In a courtroom in West Memphis in 1994, the things a teenager wore and read and wrote constituted the case for putting him on death row. No DNA linked any of the 3 defendants to the crime scene. No eyewitness placed them at Robin Hood Hills on the evening of May 5th. No physical evidence, no weapon, no clothing fiber, no blood trace connected them to the murders. What the prosecution had was Miskelly's confession and the suggestion elaborated by expert testimony and by the circumstantial evidence of who these teenagers were and what they were interested in, that they were the kind of people capable of this kind of crime. The defense pointed out the inconsistencies in the Miskelly confession. The defense pointed out the absence of physical evidence. The defense argued that the expert testimony about satanic ritual was not science, but speculation. The jury deliberated. The jury convicted. Damien Echols was sentenced to death. Jason Baldwin was sentenced to life without parole. Jesse Miskelly was sentenced to life plus 40 years. After the verdict, reporters interviewed members of the community. The responses reflected a community that had been frightened and was now relieved. Not satisfied exactly, not at peace, but relieved in the way that a community is relieved when a verdict arrives and the uncertainty is over and the thing can be named and the named thing can be punished. People said the system had worked. They said the right people had been found. They said their children were safer now. In the years that followed, some of them would change their minds. Others never did. In 1996, an HBO documentary called Paradise Lost: The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills was released. Filmmakers Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky had spent months in West Memphis during the trials and in the period immediately after. They had filmed the community, the families, the defendants, the legal proceedings. They had access that journalists rarely get to a story of this kind, and they used it to produce something that functioned less like a crime documentary and more like a portrait of a place trying to understand something it could not understand. The film reached audiences that had no connection to West Memphis. Arkansas audiences who looked at Damien Echols and did not see a satanic murderer, but a teenager smart and strange and badly served by the institutions around him. Who looked at the trial record and saw the absence of physical evidence. Who looked at the Miskelly interrogation and saw a minor with diminished capacity being questioned for 12 hours without representation. Celebrity support began to arrive. Attorneys, forensic experts, a second documentary, a third. Organizations dedicated to the wrongful conviction case. The world outside West Memphis was becoming convinced that 3 people had been imprisoned for crimes they did not commit. West Memphis itself was more divided. The families of the murdered boys were split. Some came to believe the West Memphis 3 were innocent. Others maintained their guilt through everything that followed. John Mark Byers, the stepfather of Christopher Byers, had been one of the most vocal advocates for the conviction in the years immediately after the trial. By 2007, he had changed his position entirely. "They're innocent," he said in an interview. "They did not kill my son. And this is wrong what the state of Arkansas is doing to cover their ass." The DNA testing began in 2005 and extended through 2007. The technology available in 1994 had not been capable of producing the results that 2005 technology could produce. Investigators and attorneys for the defense submitted evidence from the crime scene fibers. Hair's materials from the ligatures that had been used to bind the boys for modern forensic analysis. The results were not ambiguous. None of the DNA found at the crime scene belonged to Echols Baldwin or Miskelly. Not a trace. In 18 years of imprisonment, the state of Arkansas had not been able to place any of the 3 men at Robin Hood Hills through physical evidence. The DNA results confirmed what the physical evidence had always suggested: they were not there. But the DNA results also found something else. A hair recovered from one of the ligatures was found to be consistent with the DNA of Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of Stevie Branch, one of the 3 murdered boys. A second hair found near the crime scene was consistent with a friend of Hobbs. 3 witnesses who came forward after seeing news coverage of the DNA findings said that Terry Hobbs's nephew had told them his uncle was responsible for the murders. 2 witnesses said they had seen Hobbs with the 3 boys on the evening they disappeared, a direct contradiction of Hobbs's claim that he had not seen the children that day. Hobbs was never charged. He was never seriously investigated. The interview conducted by Arkansas law enforcement after the DNA results became known lasted, according to his defense team, for a handful of questions before it was concluded. He maintains his innocence. The state of Arkansas, faced with DNA, evidence that did not match its convictions and did match someone who had never been investigated, had a choice. It could open a new trial which would require presenting the DNA evidence and the new witness accounts in open court, which would require confronting formally and publicly the question of whether the right people had been convicted. Or it could find another way. It found another way. The Alford plea that freed Eccles Baldwin and Miss Kelly in August 2011 was their attorneys set a deal from hell. It was the only deal available. Damian Eccles' execution date was approaching. The legal avenues for further appeal were narrowing. Baldwin, who had refused early plea offers because he would not agree to any arrangement that left Eccles on death row, finally agreed in order to save his friend's life. The 3 men walked out of the Jonesboro courthouse and into cameras and supporters and the particular complicated freedom of people who have been released but not cleared. They cannot vote in some contexts. They carry felony convictions on their records. Damian Eccles, who has spoken and written extensively about his years in prison and his continuing fight for exoneration, has described the Alford plea as a way for the state to make the problem go away without taking responsibility for it. The state agreed to disagree. It let 3 men go home. It kept its conviction. As of the time this story is told, Damian Eccles' attorneys are pursuing new DNA testing using advanced forensic technology. The Arkansas Supreme Court granted permission for the testing. The results may or may not produce what Eccles and his supporters hope they will produce. They may or may not change anything in a legal system that has already demonstrated its preference for the Alford plea over the reckoning. The murders of Steve Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers have never been officially solved. No one has been charged, tried, or convicted for those murders in a proceeding that has survived legal challenge. 3 men spent 18 years in prison, one of them on death row, for a crime that the physical evidence does not support their having committed. And the community of West Memphis, Arkansas, has been living with both of those facts simultaneously in whatever way communities live, with the things they cannot fully reconcile. I have thought a great deal about West Memphis, not about the case, but about the town itself. About what it was in May 1993 when 3 boys did not come home. About what it needed in the days that followed, and what it got, and whether what it got was what it actually needed. The answer to that last question is clearly no. What West Memphis got was an arrest that relieved the immediate pressure, a trial that confirmed the arrest, a verdict that provided the closure that communities seek after terrible things happen. The naming and the punishing, the sense that the world has been made more orderly by the identification of the person responsible for the disorder. What that pressure felt like from inside the community is something worth trying to understand. A small town where 3 second graders rode their bikes away and never came back. Where the investigation was moving slowly, and the community was afraid, and the question of who had done this was everywhere, at the grocery store, at the church, at the school, where parents were watching their children with a new and frightened attention, where every evening that passed without an answer was another evening of that specific, grinding fear. The police felt it. The investigators felt it. The community communicated it to them in the direct and indirect ways that communities communicate pressure to the people responsible for making them safe. And when a confession arrived, even a contradictory one, even a recanted one, even one given by a teenager who had been in a room for 12 hours without representation, the pressure eased. The community could breathe again. That is not a defense of what happened. It is an attempt to understand how it happened, because understanding how it happened is the only way to understand why it has been so difficult for 30 years to fully undo. What West Memphis did not get was the truth about what happened to those 3 boys. It has not gotten it yet. There is a particular thing that happens in a community after a wrongful conviction begins to unravel. The community has to find a way to hold 2 things simultaneously: the grief of what happened to the victims, which is real and permanent, and does not go away, and the growing evidence that the people punished for it were not responsible. These 2 things are not incompatible, but they feel incompatible because accepting the second one seems like it might require diminishing the first. Like saying the boys' deaths mattered less than the technical question of whether the right people were convicted. It does not require that at all. What it requires is something harder: the willingness to say that a terrible thing happened, and that in trying to answer it, the town made another terrible thing happen, and that both of those things are true, and that the first does not excuse the second. West Memphis has not fully said that. Arkansas has not said it. The Alford plea was designed specifically so that neither of them would have to. Damien Eccles wore black and listened to heavy metal and checked out library books about Wicca and grew up in a town that did not have a place for him. He was 18 years old when he was arrested. He spent 18 years of his life on death row in Arkansas for murders he maintains he did not commit and that the physical evidence does not connect him to. The 3 boys in Robin Hood Hills deserved better than what the investigation gave them. The 3 teenagers who were convicted deserved better. The community of West Memphis deserved better. Deserved an investigation that was thorough enough and honest enough to find what actually happened, instead of an investigation that found what it needed to find. What actually happened in Robin Hood Hills on the evening of May 5, 1993, has never been established in a court of law. That is the thing West Memphis is still living with. That is the thing that the Alford plea did not resolve, and that new DNA testing may or may not resolve, and that the legal system of Arkansas has so far shown no interest in resolving on its own. 3 boys died. 3 other people lost 18 years. And the question at the center of it, what happened and who did it, is still more than 30 years later unanswered.